So let's dive into this book club.
Okay.
So this one is on the outward mindset by the Arbinger Institute. And I have a few notes. I don't have a ton of notes on this. But first of all, so you have chosen this book to be, I guess, featured reading for almost all of your workshops in the last couple of years.
Yes.
What is it about this particular book that is so compelling that you've chosen to, I guess, integrate that into your work, into your workshop work so completely?
Well, it's a book that in a few pages, it's not a huge book, really lays out the argument and the discussion to understand a viewpoint of how change takes place in human relationships. And it really stands apart from that which is written mostly in business books. And that is, change people's behavior and their mindset will change after their behavior changes. And the Arbinger Institute has really gone back and looked at the fundamental work in psychology and recognized that that's not true, that all of what we know in psychology is that when you change your mindset, that behavior follows along. But if you try to change people's behavior and mindset tries to follow it, what will happen is behavior will change, but the mindset will stay very stable, and therefore you get this what's called washback of behavior. The behavior goes back to the old place. And that's really an important conversation to have in the world of business now, that much of what's been written about behavior change, really, if you're talking about very simple skill behaviors, it applies. But when you're talking about creating new organizations or organizations that are less hierarchical and more collaborative, and that involves changing mindset, that I believe it's their insight into that process is accurate, well documented, and leads to successful change for people. And it's a kinder model on people. It isn't judgmental. It's really about recognizing the power of how mindset changes behavior. So that's why I've been recommending it. And also because it's well written. They spent a lot of time writing it in a way that most of us could understand, and that in a length that isn't daunting. We can pick up that book and read it in a day or two. And also because they use stories.
You can.
Well, I can. The way that they use stories are, it's helpful to recognize they use stories in which I can see myself in, and most people can find our own behavior in. They're not so out of ordinary stories. And I think that's a powerful learning tool then, to be able to see ourselves in those stories. So it's a book that actually I probably have purchased 25 copies and given all of them away. I can barely find my own now. But
So I read it based on your recommendation. And the thing that I found the concept compelling, what I would consider the main broad concept. Is that Sophie?
Yeah.
So you've given us a broad outline of the value of the outward mindset is that the big concept being, if you change behavior, or if you change mindset, that behavior will follow, and that you don't get the sliding back into past old behaviors if our mindset is no longer in that position, if we're no longer looking through that lens.
Right.
Are there any other, I guess, ideas that are in that book that are maybe less broad, that are more specific, but still have a broad application?
Well, I think that one of the areas that are applicable is that if you can say jump up on the moon and observe your own behavior, if you can begin to observe your own behavior without putting either a good or bad sign to it, whether my behavior is good or whether it's bad, but be able to observe it. Observe, this is what's happening. That in itself helps you recognize, gives you a better perspective of what's going on in relationships, or in both, like one-on-one or in a whole group, because your brain, you're really activating the front part of your brain rather than highly emotionalized, highly triggered responses. And I think that alone, learning that process of being able to take a breath, put some kind of stop place in it to say, hey, Joan, let's take a breath and take a look at this. Being able to do that has a major impact on changing your own behavior. And you can practice that over and over and over again, because we all get hijacked. We all get emotionally charged into something, and that skews our perspective. That's one thing to know that, but it's quite different to learn a technique that says, let me drop back, let me look at this differently. And I think about it as jumping up on the moon and taking a look at what's really going on. And then being able to create a strategy, a perspective that says, what is it that I want? What is it that, and what is my part in this? I think it's hard to be able to see our own negative behavior without being able to get some perspective. And I think that's one of the most important skills to be able to develop is, how is my behavior keeping the old pattern going, or keeping the negative response going?
Sorry.
So that's for me the most exciting and applicable part of their book.
Do you think that having quote unquote an outward mindset is a necessary step in being able to observe your own, or the impact of your own behavior? Or how do you link having an outward mindset, which is, as I perceive it, thinking about the other person's perspective? Is that critical to being able to observe your impact?
Yes, because I think that when you're able to really embrace the idea of outward mindset, it changes the way you think. I'm really wondering about, well, I wonder what that's like for that group or that team. I wonder what's really happening for them. What is their story? That's really different than from me coming at it from a point of view of my story, saying that group, they'll never do it, they just don't get it. That, an outward mindset is, I wonder what would be helpful for them.
But how do we say we're in a situation in which we're a leader of an organization, or even of an individual, and that there are people who are, say, underperforming. How do you balance the needs of the other, say, and the needs of the organization as a whole?
Well, I think it's helpful to say that underperformance is a construct. It's a way that we talk about what something has done relative to some structure or some outcome that we had in place for them. And that I think it's really important to be able to say, my wondering is not to be able to just describe the underperformance, right? From my point of view, I can describe that. What's really important is, how do you understand it, and what would shape a different performance? Because I think what's really ultimate is, when I talk about outward mindset, it isn't about being soft on problems. The performance needs to change, but can it be soft on hard on the problem and soft on people? That is, help you be more responsible, help you really be more responsible for your behavior.
Okay.
So it is not about everybody gets, we let everybody sort of give a pass, or give myself a pass. If I'm facilitating or supporting your growth, then my goal is, for whatever the stated expectation is, that we actually are on a path to get there. And that you know the path, and I know the path. And then everybody will say, so what if you don't get there? Well, then you have to go back and say, did we not create a successful path? Was it too ambitious? Is it the right path for you? What part is it in terms of the structure, and what part is it in terms of your gifts and talents? And I think it's irresponsible sometimes to say is that right now it doesn't look like your gifts and talents in this time frame line up with this task. That's responsible to both people. But then what? How do we really help shape that next conversation?
How do you make sure that you don't come to that conclusion too early or too late?
Well, I don't think you ever know. I mean, that's always that's what the question that people ask. I think that when you first start coaching and working with people, or you in business terms supervising people, is that you early on, many people will come to that conclusion too fast, and that's because managers are really taught to judge very quickly. I think as you gain skill and some experience, that you will tend to do that less. You'll look at a process about what are you learning, rather than about a specific point in time. Whether you did it or you didn't do it doesn't give you much information. So, and it's really important to be able to hold people, support people in accountability. Whoever I'm coaching or supervising, is my gift is to hold you accountable, support accountability between the two of us. I don't like to use hold accountable, because that has a harshness, but I do think it's helpful. It's really important to support accountability, to say this is the quality of accountability.
I'm trying to think I had something in my head. I wanted to follow up on something that you had said, and I can't remember what it was. I knew I should have wrote it down. Oh, that's exactly what it was. So you said that whether somebody does or does not do a task, that doesn't actually give you much learning. What are the things that do provide value in terms of the learning? And how do you integrate those into your management?
Well, I think, for example, that if someone says, I'll have this done, or this is on my agenda to have done, and yet I can't have it done, then that's very human to be able to say what the time frame, I was too generous with my time frame, and I'll have to get back to it. And to check in with everyone that I didn't do it. Now that could be responsible if the impact on other people's job is minimal, that I'm not influencing anyone else's job, I'm influencing mine, but I'm not impacting other people's job. That's a responsible conversation to have. But it's a different conversation that if I have 4 people on my team and I say I'm coming on Wednesday with it done, and I don't have it done, and I don't share that with anybody. There's no sharing. I just come to the meeting and say my part isn't done, and everybody else then isn't done. That I think is not responsible. I'm not holding myself accountable in a healthy way. And I'm not supporting them being accountable for their part. I'm sabotaging their accountability. So when you talk about that time frame, it's a relative conversation. If what I said I was going to do impacted other people's contribution, that's a much higher level of accountability to that time and date. Okay? And that's really important to be able to recognize holding myself accountable in a reasonable way, not blowing it off or having an excuse. So part of holding yourself accountable is, which is difficult for many of us, is really being able to understand what time do I really have. Does that make sense? Is there really time in my week to do this? That's another kind of accountability. Being able to have that conversation, it's really important self-accountability. Do I really have time to do this?
In a realistic time frame.
In a realistic time frame, not an idealistic. That if we're looking at projects and I'm intersecting with you, then that's really important to be able to say, what kind of time frame do I have? And to know that, for example, last week when we were going to talk on Friday, and I had made an unrealistic assumption about my control over the week, what was going to happen in my week, and that Friday turned out to be something totally different, and I had to say to you, I really need to move that meeting till Monday. that part of that, my learning always is, more realistically, it would have been wiser in the beginning to say Monday.
Sure.
Not. I mean, to really spend some time thinking about really how much control do I have on my time this week. So that's what I mean by holding myself more accountable to it, to communicate with you accurately, but to also know that I disappointed you and that you could say to me, well, that's disappointing. We can do it Monday, but that's disappointing. And that's a realistic, I think, and a healthy conversation.
I think I said bummed.
Bummed. Yeah, but bummed, I think that, well, I guess bummed. I think of words that it's, bummed. Disappointment is this long line, and bummed may be slightly disappointed. And there's another kind of more disappointment over here. Recognizing that's healthy to know. Doesn't mean we can't move it, but it does mean that my behavior impacts you and impacts the project.
So it impacts me, certainly, impacts the project, certainly, but I guess what does the impact say? I'm trying to think of if you had come to that with two different mindsets. Say you came to it with an inward mindset. How would your approaching of that situation been different, or your read on the situation been potentially different? And what would your behavior have been any different?
Well, if I would have seen that the problem is that other people changed their mind and changed their decisions about time, which impacted my decision, and I recognized that I could have been angry about that. And also that when I then communicated to you, my time really is not in, I don't have as much control over my time. And then you said, well, I'm bummed. Then I could have gotten mad at you and said, look, you don't even understand what's going on here. You don't have any room to be bummed. Get over it and let's just reschedule. But I recognize that, yes, that your feelings or your experience of that was important, and that I didn't have to feel badly about it. I recognized my part in it. It just is. And could we reschedule? So it doesn't have a big positive or a negative in it.
Right. Yeah, I guess there's an interesting piece in that from my perspective. My experience of that was that you said, basically, my schedule isn't as free as I thought it was. Can we reschedule this call for Monday? I didn't hear everybody around me is changing the plans, so I can't make it because everybody else is doing something they shouldn't be doing, or they're changing their schedule, so my schedule has to change in response. And I think that would have been a different conversation had you been coming to it with a very inward mindset, where you may have been blaming of the people you thought were responsible for impacting your schedule.
But I don't think it would be helpful. An outward mindset is I could also look at their lives and say, I get this.
Right.
Okay, and what were the agreements within that milieu and all of that. So I didn't feel blameful. I recognized that my assessment of the situation set up a scarcity of time. And I could again use that in future time as well, as to say, well, I wonder what that's going to look like. The part that I think when I can stay in an outward mindset is when I come to you, is I don't have to tell you all that story or even what that story is. And I can be more available to you and your response, because that's what's important, is our relationship. And I can be available to that response. That's why outward mindset is so powerful from a leadership point of view, is I don't bring whatever the past conversation is gets finished and doesn't come into this conversation then with, I don't start ascribing motivation to you, or I don't have a spillover effect on the next conversation.
So how do we, utilizing an outward mindset, how do we come to conversations in a larger organization without being overrun? I mean, if you're always trying to be accommodating to the other person.
Well, I don't think outward mindset is accommodating. I think it's mindful of.
What's the difference?
Well, I think mindful of is that I'm present right here, right now in this, let's say in our conversation about setting up this meeting. And I felt very, very much part of that, what our relationship was about. And I wasn't spilling stuff over from the previous conversations or what else had been happening. I wasn't accommodating you. I was present with you. That it could have been that this conversation was that you would have said something like, "Oh, that is not possible. My Monday is really jammed up," or something, and so let's go to Plan B. And then I could have begun to sort of strategize what that could be without being upset with you. Does that make sense? Without being, because I'm not accommodating you. I'm really saying Monday's better in my schedule. Can you come back to Monday? Sometimes people will say, this is the time frame we have. Can you do that? And I may have to say, I can't meet that time frame. That's not realistic. Not out of harshness, but out of the reality of the schedule.
I can understand why you would want that, but I can't agree to it. Is that the perspective?
Yes, I understand how you want it. It isn't like you're asking something unreasonable from me, or you don't understand what you're asking, or any of the other kinds of things I could put on it. I can hear it and then recognize that for my answer is I can't do that now. I can't accommodate that request.
What do you see as being the biggest challenges to implementing or trying to get an organization as a whole to implement an outward mindset? Because Arbinger talks about, if we integrate an outward mindset into organizations, it can be a transformational experience that can radically improve the effectiveness and efficiency of an organization. How do we as a leader who wants to bring this into their workplace, how do we do that?
Well, I think there are three layers in it. The layer that we were just talking about is individuals having conversations in which we practice over time being clear and honest with each other in a good way so that our relationship stays intact. We have high trust, and that we focus on the outcomes. What can we do really? That begins to change the organization dramatically. So that if I call you up and say, hey, I have this thing, and you don't just say, yes, I have to do it, and then you put the phone down and you say, you can't imagine what they just said, right? That kind of conversation doesn't take place. After that, if that could happen, the effectiveness of people's relationship begin to change the efficiencies of every single system. So that's one layer of change that takes place. The second layer of change takes place is when you really trust each other. You hold out for holding each other at higher and higher levels of accountability. Can we do this better? What are the 7 different ways we could do this? That's just about innovation, but it's also a way of trusting each other and to being able to say, can we find a different way of doing this? Can I help you find a way, and can I help me find a way of doing this better? So the accountability within the group increases. The conversations are very different than saying, you'll never believe what that organization just sent us down an email saying we have to have this whatever done at this time. Or gave us some, just in the organization I was just in, they had received an email that said their target was to increase production by 7% in the next 6 months. And just given that target that is their that has to happen. But they don't have any way of doing that unless they can embrace in understanding how it is they can change their dynamic to make that increase.
So are you saying then that, say, like, I guess I'm not quite following that example.
Well, for example, to give to send somebody a target of saying we need to increase production by 7% is a very poor leadership structure. Leadership has to be able to set goals in a very different way. And that's one of the processes that Arbinger talks about. How do you put that together? How do you co-create the goals and processes that are going to govern your direction?
So let's say there's a small business owner who says, I have a target of growing 7% in the next 6 months. And that's something we need to do in order to be able to essentially pay the bills in this coming year. How would you advise that person to articulate that vision to the rest of the team?
Well, this is a rabbit hole now, but organizing people around you making more money is not a very inspiring goal.
But if it's necessary,
it could be necessary, but the way to it is having a better product, doing more, finding where are the places where we can, where's the innovation or the efficiencies that we can all find so that can happen. But to say we need this to pay the bills is a demotivating goal. Doesn't inspire anybody to come up with a new idea or to hold myself at a higher level of creativity or possibility.
That makes sense to me.
Part of the Arbinger piece is to really help leaders learn how that in order for teams to really want to put more time and energy toward a goal, it's really important to be able to articulate what that goal is for everybody. An outward mindset would be a leader who recognized when the whole group is doing better, the business is going to do better. That's outward mindset. Inward mindset is, we're not paying the bills and I'm scared to death, and so get out there and sell more. That's an inward mindset.
Right. It alleviates my fear if this thing occurs, regardless of what impact it has on you.
On anyone else. Or on a year further than that. It's a short-term fix. It's based on your fear. And that's an inward mindset that is often used, but it's not effective.
What are the challenges of trying to apply an outward mindset on a regular basis?
I think that the challenge is you can't go on automatic. You've got to show up and be present to what's really happening. And I think that in our world, our lives today, that when there's so much in front of us, the way we get through so much is to go on automatic, to go on old patterns of solving problems rather than staying present to what's really in front of us.
That's a big challenge.
I think that's a big challenge.
Are there any?
And you can't do it perfectly, but more and more, it is a pattern you can develop.
How are there any resources or tools available to people who want to be able to cultivate that skill?
Well, I think here's where the Arbinger work blends into the new, new science of neuroanatomy and understanding how the brain works. Because I think that all the work that's being done on emotional intelligence, all the work that's being done on presence, on learning. Using mindfulness training, using any kind of technique that helps you not be reactive, first of all, and the other is using techniques that help you stay present rather than go on automatic default behavior.
Sounds like meditation.
Like meditation helps. Mindfulness training helps, prayer helps, exercise helps. There's lots of things that help so that you can stay present. When you get overwhelmed and there's too much for you, the tendency then is to go in a default, which is kind of in the back of the brain. They call it the lizard brain. And that is, you're going to make decisions out of very old patterns of behavior. And you make them because you can trust them. They've been there. They may have worked or may not have worked, but you don't have to think about them so much.
Or you don't think about them.
Or you don't think about them. They do drop into that kind of unconscious response.
Well, that's a big topic.
Yes, I'm sure that's a big topic.
I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more. But are there any other similar resources that people can turn to, any other literature that might be helpful, or in a similar vein to try to, fill in some of the spaces around the idea of outward mindset?
Well, Arbinger has two other books, The Anatomy of Peace and Leadership and Self-Deception. And they unpack this idea, each of those a little more. So I always encourage people to...
Those were written before, though, weren't they?
They were, yes. This book is really the refinement book, and that is, it takes... I think those books are more in depth. It's okay. Sort of like they wrote two in-depth books, and then they wrote a refined book. That's this book is easier to understand. I think the other thing that is helpful is all the work that's being done on looking at emotional intelligence is really helpful. And all the work that's being done on collaborative learning and collaborative leadership, because that conversation is the idea of learning how to collaborate is a big conversation in our culture, because we're just emerging out of a highly authoritarian model, business organizational model. And still collaboration is an emerging trend. It isn't the mainstream yet, although it is. If you begin to look at the major conversations, it certainly is the emerging edge.
What are the if you were to name a couple of interesting things or resources, books that you've been excited about tapping into on those topics, what would those be?
Well, I think that Kagan and Leahy, they're two people from Harvard, have written a couple of books that are really, really interesting. And one of them is called the Everybody Culture. It really is about how do you create a transparent, open, collaborative organization. That could be a family, that could be a community organization, and it can be a business. They really are working with businesses. I think Lencioni's work about his new book called The Advantage, where he talks about the workplace culture, is the number one competitive and advantage of any company. And that is on the bestseller of business books now. So in 20 years' time, that this has been a trend, but now it's really emerging into the mainstream culture. The conversation about collaboration, though, is we don't have those skills yet. Most people haven't developed effectiveness in collaboration because we've lived in more authoritative and authoritarian models. So our emotional development isn't as strong when you move into collaborative models of working together. And I think the Arbinger Institute is really a pioneer in helping people learn, moving from authoritative to collaborative models.
It seems like as an individual in a leadership role, it would be really difficult if you were in a historically structured authoritarian kind of top-down leadership structure to be able to identify. I mean, there's a lot of personal work that has to be done if you were to shift from an inward to an outward mindset. How would you, I guess, encourage people to start that process? Because it seems like you would need a lot of reflection, and like you would need somebody to be able to reflect that back to you, what your impact is having on other people. And if you're in a structure in which people are maybe too scared, say, to actually reflect honestly back to you what you are doing, how would that person be able to start that process or engage in that process, even if they wanted to? What would be the first or second step?
Well, which person is engaging?
The leader. The leader who knows that they want to develop an outward mindset. They see the advantages of it. The advantages are clear. But it's really hard to start to be able to identify how my behavior is actually impacting other people.
Yes. And I think is there are many, many ways to start. There's really, some people do it without any help from anyone, reading a book, opening their own awareness to it, asking questions, and they begin on a journey over time to develop their own awareness, right? And other people use executive coaching, and that's one of the reasons executive coaching has become such a big area, is trying to help leaders move from authoritative-based leadership to collaborative leadership. because you need someone to help mirror back to you and help you recognize who you can trust. But also, I think a leader, is if you adapt it because you think it's going to make you look better, or you're going to get a promotion, you probably won't be very successful in it. Because there's a way in which being in an outward mindset is really, there's a shift that takes place in your consciousness, and that is that when the group does better, I'll do better, right? It's a consciousness shift. And it isn't like if I do this now, I will get a promotion. Because that's still inward mindset. It's about what is best for me, and I'll just try to get everybody else to go along with me. And that's a really different understanding. And this is an interesting conversation to me, because it's the fundamental shift in consciousness is to recognize that you're part of a whole system of people and things and events. You're not an isolate, you're not just one entity, but you are really part of a very elaborate system. And if that's a shift, that if you can't make it, then you will stay in a much more authoritative model. And that model is based on competition with each other and a hierarchy of who's going to get up the ladder faster. And it works still in some situations, but it really is on the wrong side of history. I mean, that model is on the side of history that is now being replaced more and more by much different kind of models in terms of leadership.
And I'm assuming you're convinced that it's more effective.
I'm convinced that it's more effective because a whole system understanding is able to meet complexity in a much more effective and efficient way than an authoritative model. It's too cumbersome, it's too bureaucratic, it's too slow.
And it relies on the leader to have all
the answers. And they can't. In an age of complexity that we're living in, and is, if you could say that we begin to recognize it's more and more complex, is that one person can't possibly have the answers like they did in 1950. If they could have had in 1950. That also could have been an illusion, I don't know. But that's a rabbit hole. At least for now, is to know that in the business world today, it's a cliche to talk about change. I mean, we don't even have words that can grasp the complexity of what business models look like today. And one person, although they may be the CEO, cannot possibly be the person who knows everything about that company now.
Well, I think that's a fairly good point to wrap up on.
Okay.